Welcome, everyone, to the In Her Image podcast, seeking and celebrating our Mother God in scripture, scholarship, meditation, the arts, and everyday life. Jess and I are so excited to share this interview with you tonight. We're really excited about our guest. We love to have scholars on our podcast, and so I will just give a brief introduction. Our guest is currently a scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He also works as adjunct faculty teaching ancient scripture at BYU. He received his bachelor's degree from BYU in ancient Near Eastern studies, focusing on biblical Hebrew and minoring in classical Greek. He completed a Master of Studies in Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford and a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies at Trinity Western University. In early 2020, he defended his doctoral dissertation, written for the University of Exeter, on the cognitive science of religion and the conceptualization of deity and divine agency in the Hebrew Bible. So looking forward to hearing more about that. He is also married and has 3 daughters. So we are so excited to welcome Dan McClellan to our podcast this evening. Welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for taking time to sit with us, answer our questions, and share your wealth of knowledge and education about the Bible and the ancient religious practices.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate the introduction.
Of course. You're welcome. We are thrilled to have another scholar on our podcast. We do enjoy a lot of personal experiences of women, and but it's always a treat when we can have a scholar help us to dive into the scriptures. So I will just kind of jump in to our first question, just trying to get to know you a little more. How did you end up as a scripture translation supervisor for the church? And kind of like, what was it that drew you into this career and pursuit of ancient texts?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, but I joined the church when I was 20. I was baptized when I was 20. I left for a mission a year later. And I was new to the church. I knew as a missionary I was going to be around other missionaries who knew the scriptures quite well. I had a year. I had never read any scriptures before that. I figured I better get to reading. And so I read, there was a stake conference where I heard a stake president. I got baptized in Plano, Texas. I heard a stake president say that he had to read the scriptures for at least an hour each day to have the Spirit with him enough to magnify his calling. And I thought, I can do that. I was working waiting tables at the time. And so I aimed for an hour and a half. And I got through the whole standard works in that year, and then got to the mission field and realized I was well ahead of most of the other missionaries I was serving alongside. But I fell in love with studying the scriptures, and I brought the resources with me that I was allowed to. At the time, missionaries were a lot more limited regarding what extracurricular reading you could bring with you. But I brought what I could. Someone gave me a Bible dictionary on my mission. It was in Spanish, and there was a table that showed the Hebrew alphabet, the Greek alphabet, and then the modern Latin equivalents. And I realized if I had a Hebrew text, I could at least decipher the sounds that the text is making. I didn't know it at the time, but that's called transliteration. And I had one of the old Institute Old Testament manuals. And I knew there was a page in there that showed a page from the Hebrew Bible. So I photocopied it, and I spent the next several weeks trying to decipher what the text was so that I could at least try and read it out loud, and then started trying to decipher the language by looking at a translation and comparing recurring words and all this kind of stuff, and did an awful job trying to decipher and teach myself Hebrew. But I was also given a study Bible in Spanish, and it had the Apocrypha in it, and I was reading that, and that fascinated me as well. And as I was finishing up my mission, I heard there was this was 2002, late 2002, I heard there was a new major that was going to be starting up at BYU, Ancient Near Eastern Studies. And I thought, if I could make a living studying the scriptures, that would be about the coolest job in the world. And so I had been kicked out of college once before. So I did not have good odds of getting in anywhere. I thought, if anywhere, BYU would let me in. And it took a couple of tries, and I kind of snuck in through a back door in admissions that they have since closed by taking some visiting student summer semester Spanish classes and testing out. And it's all very under the table, but I got into BYU. I was able to major in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, went off to Oxford and did a master's there, and then to Canada for another master's, and then moved back to Utah while I was finishing up my thesis there. And I got a job waiting tables again. That's the easiest job for me in the world to get. I could get one within a day. It was at a country club, and this allowed me to play free golf. But I was still presenting at conferences, and I was introduced to a gentleman named Todd Harris, who at the time managed scripture translation. And he said hi at one of these conferences, and he talked about a project he was working on that he could use my help for if I was interested. And I kept in touch with him, but nothing kind of came of this project. And then in 2000, I think it was late 2012, I was coming home from a conference. I was sitting at the airport in Chicago, waiting for my flight, and the gate next to me, full of people, they got on a plane, they took off. My flight was supposed to be loading, should be gone by now, but nothing ever showed up. I went to the person and asked them about it, and they said, "Oh, we moved the gate to the gate right next to yours. So that was your flight that you just watched load and take off." And they said, "We got another flight for you. It's on the other end of the airport." Sprinted across O'Hare and plopped down right next to Todd Harris again. And he said, "What are you doing these days?" I said, "I'm waiting tables at a country club so I can play free golf." And he's like, "We can find something for you to do." So he managed to bring me on as an intern. And about 7 months later, I came on as a full-time scripture translation supervisor, and I've been doing it ever since. I managed to get into and complete a PhD during that time. And so this job has kind of fell out of the sky into my lap to help me and my family get situated. And I've been able to complete the PhD since then. I've been studying and occasionally teach courses at BYU as a part of this, and just doing my best to get to the point where, or to continue making a career out of studying the scriptures, whatever that career may turn into. And it's been a lot of fun. There have been a lot of challenges, but it is, they talk about never having to work a day in your life if you love what you do. And I maybe work 1 or 2 days a week. Let's just put it that way. There's I have to work with Workfront and PluNet and a bunch of systems that I don't understand and don't want to deal with. But other than that, I am having the time of my life making a career out of studying the scriptures.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love how you say it fell out of the sky. Like it seems so guided, right? Like all these little miracles along the way, tender mercies. And I'm grateful that you share some of the things that you've been learning on social media, or else we would have no idea about some of these things that you share. What inspired you to create the social media accounts on TikTok and Instagram?
Well, the Instagram one I've had for a few years. I actually ran for the state legislature in 2018 and in 2020. And as a part of that is in an effort to try to be a little more present online, because I knew that was an important channel for campaigning and other things. I got an Instagram account, and it really just turned into me sharing photos of my kids and trips I was taking for work and things like that. So it wasn't much, but I started seeing people sharing TikTok videos last year and the year before quite a bit on Instagram and on Facebook and on Twitter. And some of these videos happen to overlap with my areas of expertise. And I started wondering, is anybody kind of keeping tabs on people over there? Are there any what kind of expertise is present in that space. And so I got a TikTok account to go check it out. And I found out very quickly that there is not a ton of expertise. There are a lot of folks who are doing a phenomenal job trying to figure these things out for themselves, reading literature and discussing things. But credentialed experts, there aren't a lot of them over there. So I figured that was a niche that I could fill. And so I started sharing videos on TikTok where I was mainly trying to correct misinformation that was being shared. But at the same time, it's important to me that scholarship be accessible and available to the public. So I also saw it as an opportunity to the degree possible, democratize access to these scholarly resources and scholarly perspectives. And even resources a little bit. It's important to me that people have access to this kind of stuff. A lot of times these perspectives, these opinions, these conclusions are hidden behind paywalls in, $100, $200 textbooks. And a lot of the reason there is disinformation out there is because everybody is working with whatever they can find for free online, which is largely open access stuff that is outdated and has had a lot of time to work its way into some bad perspectives. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to do both of those things. And that has been my goal. And then I discovered that there was an audience on Instagram as well for the same kind of content. And so I have very inexpertly have been trying to transfer this content over to Instagram. And it has not always worked exactly as I have wanted. And I'm still on the lookout for a decent auto captioning app for my videos. But the feedback has been great from both sets of audiences. And I'm interested in trying to, at the moment, Instagram is a secondary account. I make the content primarily on TikTok and then share it to Instagram as well. But I'd like to focus on trying to better make use of the reels and the other things like that on Instagram. But as much of a novice as I am on TikTok, I'm even more of a novice on Instagram. So I have a long way to go.
Well, nevertheless, we all have benefited, and I'm not really worried about you doing any fun dances on TikTok. But, I have felt that hunger to understand the scriptures and to see how, what was the original and what other ways can we understand this? And that has, for me personally, I've felt that it is now more accessible. And, it's just usually like a bite size, like a 30-second, hey, you might have considered this. Here's some more information on it. And it just gets me thinking and gets me wanting to search more and look at scholarly things like that. So we appreciate it, as even if you feel like it's not professional.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So I want to jump into some of your expertise. Your blog says you specifically study Second Temple Judaism. So I'm hoping that you can give our listeners an idea of what that means if they've never heard that term before. Mm-hmm. What are the characteristics of First and Second Temple theology? Why is there two,
Yeah. So that's one of the bigger division in pre-antique Judaism. First Temple starts whenever the first temple was built, probably somewhere around 1000 BCE. However, there were many temples scattered around Israel and Judah in that time period. And the northern kingdom falls in about 722 BCE. Then right before 700 BCE, you have an Assyrian emperor who comes through and destroys a bunch of the other cultic sites, the temples and cult centers, and is not able to take Jerusalem. So Jerusalem survives, and the Jerusalem temple survives, at least for about another century. 605, 89, 87 BCE, the Jerusalem temple is destroyed by Babylon, and the Judahites are taken away into exile. And that period of a little less than a century of exile was one of the largest periods of crisis in the history of ancient Israel, Judah, and Judaism. And a lot of things shifted. One of the main issues was they were outside of their land. They no longer had their temple. And one of the perspectives from pre-exilic Israel and Judah that needed to be changed was the notion that the God of Israel, Adonai, was limited to the land of Israel. Every nation had their own patron deity. Israel's patron deity was Adonai. So when Naaman comes down from Syria, is healed, wants to go back to Syria and worship Adonai, the God of Israel, in Syria, he has to bring 2 cartloads of Israelite soil with him. The idea being you have to be on Israelite soil to worship the God of Israel. Similarly, when Saul is pursuing David, he's about to push him beyond the boundaries of Israel, and David says, "You are forcing me to worship other gods." So once you're in another country, you're under the authority, the jurisdiction of other gods. And so the Judahites in Babylon don't really have a way to worship Adonai, and the temple is destroyed. So even if they were back there, they wouldn't have a way to worship Adonai. And there's a psalm where they say, "How can we sing the songs of Adonai in a foreign land?" It just didn't compute. And so there is some revision of their worldview that takes place in this period where the jurisdiction of the God of Israel spreads to the whole earth. And Psalm 82 is one of the ways that this is accomplished. So in Psalm 82, it talks about God standing up in the midst of the gods in the divine council and condemns the gods for negligence, for allowing all this injustice to reign. And it ends with them being condemned to mortality. And then the last verse says, "Rise up, O God, for you shall inherit all nations." And this is the universalization of Adonai. And this is a way to say the gods of the nations failed in allowing Israel to be exiled. That rocked the cosmic order. And so the gods of the nations have all been deposed, and now Adonai will take over rule of all nations. And now we are under Adonai's jurisdiction once again. And so when they return, when Persia defeats Babylon, Persia allows the Judahites to return to the land, they rebuild the temple. And so this is called the Second Temple, or the Temple of Zerubbabel. And this lasts all the way up until 68, 69, 70 CE, when the Romans come in and destroy the temple. So the Second Temple period lasts from about 519 BCE all the way to about 68 to 70 CE. And that period includes, it can be divided as well into the Persian period, where Judah was under the rule of the Persian Empire, and the Hellenistic, and then the Roman periods. And in this period, there's a lot more literary production going on. There's a lot more creativity in the writing. You have a lot of literature produced that does not end up in what would ultimately be the Hebrew Bible. The first book of Enoch is a very influential book of Jubilees. You have testaments of patriarchs. You have a number of apocryphal and apocalyptic texts that are written, a bunch of what are called pseudepigraphic texts, where people are writing texts in the name of authoritative figures from centuries before. And so a lot is changing in this period. Developments are taking place in concepts of deity, and particularly in the angels. Before the exile, they conceptualized the pantheon as having the high deity and the high deity's consort. And then a second tier of deities would be the offspring, the sons of God, the children of God. And then the bottom tier would be the servile deities, who were largely messengers. In the Second Temple period, there is a desire to distance Adonai from all these other subservient deities. And so what happens is they all get squished down into the bottom tier. And so you have Adonai way up high, and everybody else gets turned into angels. So one of the clearest manifestations of this is in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, where it says, "The Most High divided up the nations according to the number of the children of God. Now, we have that reading because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of our translations of the Hebrew Bible today will say children of Israel, but that was a change that was later introduced to the text. And so according to this very, very ancient poem, every nation has its own deity. By the time of the Hellenistic period, the book of Daniel and other literature, you now have this concept of angels. Every nation has a guardian angel. So this illustrates this squishing down of these sovereign deities over each nation to this servile angel status. And this is where we get Michael, as the Daniel calls him, the chief prince. And you have the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. These are the guardian angels over each of these nations. So all these ideas are constantly being renegotiated in light of the group's needs and goals and circumstances in a given period. And they would continue to develop after the biblical period as well.
Wow. So it sounds like what you're saying is about the time of when we believe Lehi's family left Jerusalem, this large shift in worship is happening, in this conflation of, bringing Adonai as the only God we can worship or acknowledge. You can correct me if I'm wrong. That multiple prophets like Jeremiah were upset about changes in the temple. Is that correct? Or
so
is upset too strong of a word?
Well, you have the interesting thing here from an academic point of view. A lot of these texts seem to have been written and edited and collated over a long period of time. And so scholars tend to divide up, like Jeremiah, into some stuff that's pre-exilic and some other stuff that is exilic. And so it's difficult to kind of disentangle what comes from earlier periods and what comes from later. But yeah, there is a lot of concern in Jeremiah and some other prophets for the exclusive worship of Adonai. In the earliest periods, there probably was not as much concern. But I mentioned the destruction of all the other cult sites around Jerusalem, but the survival of the Jerusalem temple. One of the things that did was help the king and the priesthood in that temple institutionalize the notion that that was the only temple that it was okay to worship at. So it goes from we can worship just about anywhere, you're the nearest local temple, to you can only worship in Jerusalem, which also meant you could only worship the one deity that was in the temple in Jerusalem. So folks who probably had no problem worshiping Ashera, worshiping some of the other deities that may or may not have been associated with Adonai, with Ashera, and with other functions. Sometimes you would look for a deity who could do what you needed done. And so this all gets concentrated and consolidated within the figure of Adonai after the destruction of all the cult sites. So by the time of Jeremiah, you were only supposed to worship Adonai. So that is part of what's going on here. The exile is being blamed on the infidelity of the people of Judah to this exclusive worship of Adonai. Usually it's being blamed on worship of Baal, who was the other storm deity in the area. And Adonai is also conceptualized as a storm deity in the Hebrew Bible.
Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about a people who I have always thought of as monotheistic. These groups of people that I think most of us, it's like the Bible says there's only one God, there can only be one God. But from what you're saying, it sounds like it was common knowledge, common belief that there are multiple gods, and it varied how they worship them and so forth. So thank you for enlightening us on that. Useful.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you've used the names Adonai and Ashera and some of these other names of these gods. Will you clarify for us who exactly is Adonai? Who is Ashera? And you've talked in some of your videos about God having a wife. So
Mm-hmm.
Who's the wife? Who's the consort that you mentioned? How do they all fit together?
So in the earliest periods, and we know this by comparing the literature of early Israel to the literature of nations from around Israel, and we have probably the largest corpus of text comes from a city called Ugarit, and they wrote in a language called Ugaritic, and they were destroyed. That city was destroyed around 1200 BCE. But they tell stories that are very, very similar to some of the stories told in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, there are a couple of places where it's very clear that the story told in the Ugaritic literature was borrowed by the biblical authors. And they describe their pantheon in great detail. And the high deity is El. He is the patriarchal deity over the pantheon, is a benevolent, aged, wizened high deity, and El's consort or wife is Ashera, and she carries the title creatrix of the gods. She is the mother of all the gods. She and El are responsible for producing the other deities of the pantheon. For the most part, there are some deities that were probably brought in by foreign lands who kind of have to be situated into the pantheon somehow. But for the most part, El is the father of the gods and Ashera is the mother of the gods. And one of the second tier deities is Baal. And Baal is a storm deity. And this was very important to the area of the highlands of Israel, because in order for there to be a civilization, they need water. And Egypt and Mesopotamia have large rivers that flood every year, and that's how they can provide irrigation, and that's what sustains their agriculture. In the highlands of Israel, the rain is what sustains the agriculture. So the storm deity, who is responsible for sending the rain, becomes very, very important to them. So Baal was a very important figure. Adonai, wherever they come from, there is a debate ongoing in the scholarship right now about where Adonai comes from, whether they come from Edom in the south, or from Egypt, or from east. They come in and want to operate as a storm deity as well. And this is why the Hebrew Bible has a lot of conflict between El and Baal. Elijah has the contest with the priests of Baal, and it's basically whose storm deity is going to be able to send down lightning and set this sacrifice on fire. And Baal doesn't show up, but Adonai is the one who is successfully able to do it. And so the people cry out, Adonai hu ha-Elohim. Adonai, he is the God. Basically saying this is his jurisdiction, this is his purview, he's in charge here. In the earliest period, it seems likely that Adonai and El were two separate deities, that El was the patron or the patriarchal high deity, and that Adonai sat on that second tier. So Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, where it says, the Most High divided up the nations according to the number of the children of God, and Adonai's portion was Israel. Jacob was his allotted share or his inherited portion. And so if that early tradition is accurate, it seems likely that Adonai initially was distinct from El. At some period, the two deities become conflated and they become the same deity. And I think it's most likely that what happened was a king took the throne who was a devotee of Adonai. And instead of trying to get rid of El worship and anger the majority of his people, probably conflated the two as a means of consolidating power and consolidating influence. And so that's where you have a number of texts that try to identify El with Adonai. So in Exodus 6:3, so this is one of the stories of Moses' encounters with God on Mount Sinai. God says, I was known to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as El Shaddai, but by my name Adonai, I was not known to them. And what a lot of scholars think is that this is an effort by an editor to identify these two deities. to narratively say, well, this is how we put the two of them together, and now you should understand they're the same deity. And so Ashera is the consort of El, and when Adonai becomes conflated with El, Adonai is now the husband, the consort of Ashera. And so we have some inscriptions from around 800 BCE. One is from a place called Kuntilat Ajrud. Another is from a place called Kirbet El Kom that mention Adonai and his Ashera. And the third person suffix there, the possessive his, that is debated whether that is part of the name or if it's intended to be a possessive suffix. If it is, some scholars argue that the word Ashera there is being used to refer to a cultic object, like a stylized tree or a pole or something like that would have been set up in a cult site or in a temple. Other scholars believe that this is a reference to the goddess, that this is still part of this divine pair. And I think the inscription at Kuntilat Ajrud supports that, because there are two figures drawn immediately below the inscription and overlapping with the inscription, a male and female figure. And this is probably intended to represent Adonai and Ashera. And they are drawn in a style that is related to an Egyptian deity called Bes. But Bes imagery could be used to represent any deity. And so that doesn't mean these are not Adonai and Ashera. And most scholars, I think, today would say this is a drawing of Adonai and Ashera. So that's in the First Temple period. Once you get the destruction of all the cult sites around Jerusalem, so that only the Jerusalem's temple remains, these folks were probably not in the business of worshiping Asherah. They were probably just in the business of worshiping Adonai. And so the king Josiah begins this campaign of vilification of Asherah, because Asherah would have had her own priesthood. So her own priests and their own patterns of worship and all this. And so Josiah, in order to protect the power of Adonai's priesthood and his temple, seems to have begun to vilify this. You're not allowed to worship Asherah. Worshipping Asherah is a crime, is against the law of God. And this is where a lot of scholars believe the book of Deuteronomy began. Because Josiah comes out of the temple one day and says, guess what I found in the temple? This law, and we haven't been following it. And all the reforms that he institutes are not found in any of the other books in the Hebrew Bible, except for in Deuteronomy, in certain parts of it. And so scholars think the first layer of Deuteronomy was probably started under Josiah as a part of this campaign to shove all the other deities away, to say you can't worship these other deities. You can only worship Adonai, and only in the Jerusalem temple. So that is my breakdown of what I think is the most likely trajectory from a pantheon with God and his wife at the top to you're only allowed to worship Adonai and only in the Jerusalem temple.
Wow, so much history. Thank you for breaking that all down for us. It's
of course.
Very, very insightful. And another word that you've used a lot is cult. And I've come to understand this word differently than I used to. Will you define that for us?
I will describe it for you. I don't like, and that's a bit pedantic, but I don't like to define, but I will describe. So scholars don't use cult to mean an authoritarian group I don't like. That's kind of how most people use the word cult today. When scholars talk about cult, that means any patterns or system of worship. So that doesn't mean a religion broadly. It means the actual physical worship. If you put on special clothes to worship, if you go to a special place to worship, if you have special objects that you use to worship, those are all elements of the cult of your religion. So a religion that has systematized worship has a cult. So we refer to cultic dress, cultic food, cultic locations, cultic implements. And this is all a way to say these things were used for worship. So much different from the way we use cults commonly today.
Yes, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think that can be a stumbling block for some people today who start to look for Heavenly Mother in the Bible when they see this Ashera person, but she's associated with this word cult. Then they think, oh, okay, this is not Heavenly Mother. This is this. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if scholars would refer to temple worship as cultic, and it's not a bad thing. It's just describing this as having to do with a system of worship.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you so much for enlightening us on all of those new words. And like you said, looking back into the Bible and kind of explaining this culture that I think most of us, it's over our heads. Most of the time we just kind of accept whatever somebody told us in Sunday school. And I think there's a lot of cultural background that is very hard for us to see. And that kind of really leads into our next question. We're jumping ahead some centuries, we're shifting a little bit. But I recently listened to a podcast with Lynn on the All In podcast, and she is a scholar that spoke about how Christ shifted things, that he really changed the roles of women. He did things that were completely against the culture and the customs and even the religious laws of the time concerning women. And you have had some recent posts about women's roles during the time of Christ's ministry and positions of leadership. So I want to ask you, how did Christ involve women, and why was this information lost?
Yeah, so this is interesting, and the perspectives differ depending on the gospel author. All four gospels are written from different perspectives by different people who are writing for different audiences and different readings. And so I would say Matthew is one of the most conservative, is most concerned with presenting Christ as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, and tends to be very conservative. But you can still see some of the ways that women played important roles in not just facilitating Christ's mission, but also teaching Christ, helping Christ to adapt and adopt. The Syrophoenician woman, for instance, who surprises Christ with her faithfulness. And you'll recall the story of him saying that this food is for the children only, not for the dogs. And she responds that, but even the dogs get the scraps from the table, which is a bit of a backhanded way of doing things. But there are examples, even in Matthew, who is most conservative, of women changing the story of Christ having to roll with the response of women, who play significant roles in everything from obviously Christ's birth and upbringing all the way to his resurrection. The first women the first people at the tomb, the first people to see Christ are women. And Luke is probably the one who brings out this role the loudest, the most clearly. And part of that is because a lot of scholars believe that what Luke is writing to do is to expand the gospel to the Gentiles, but not just to the Gentiles, to everyone, meaning not just the men who are Gentiles, but also the women. So we have the most stories about women's roles in Luke. And there are John also has some interesting stories, although there's some complexities with what's going on in John with Jesus's mother, with the woman at the well. But once the church gets started, after the resurrection, it is women who are given the charge to go tell everyone. And once the church gets started, women were indisputably in leadership roles and in important positions of influence, not only filling offices, but also being patrons of churches. There were powerful women who were wealthy, who offered their homes to be used, who facilitated mission trips and things like that. So the gospel really gets spread because of the work of women. And we have women who are named in the New Testament. Paul names a number of women. In fact, I was looking at a list earlier. We have Junia, who is said to be an apostle. And whether that means she occupied the office of apostle or was given that title as one sent, that's debated among scholars. But to call her notable and among the apostles is a pretty significant accomplishment. Lydia, Dorcas, I prefer the name Tabitha, but Dorcas is the other version of that name. Phoebe, who was a deacon, who is mentioned as probably the one who delivered Paul's letter of the Romans and probably the one who read it out to the congregation in Rome when it was delivered. The first person in Europe to accept the gospel after they crossed over from Turkey into Macedonia was a woman, and she offered her home and facilitated the preaching of the gospel to the rest of Macedonia. So everywhere you turn, even though we like to center the men in these stories, things are being facilitated by women. And I think that the received wisdom is that by the time the church is assimilated to the leadership of the empire, the Roman Empire, so the 4th century, it's assumed that that is when men kind of said, okay, we'll take it from here. However, there is evidence that women continued to occupy positions of leadership, or at least positions of significant influence within churches scattered around the Roman Empire, probably until 6th, 7th, 8th, maybe 9th century CE. However, at some point, the patriarchy does take over. And this may be why the stories center men in the New Testament. These texts were written in the 1st, 2nd century, but they were probably edited, probably revised until the versions that we have now, which date to at the earliest. We have tiny fragments from the 2nd century. Most of our manuscripts are 4th century or later. So by the time Rome is taking over, by the time the patriarchy's influence is probably eclipsing the influence of women, that's when the texts seem to stabilize. So it's possible that there is even more influence that has been lost of women. But there is a lot of work. Fortunately, the academy has more and more women in it every day, more and more women from all kinds of different backgrounds, different experiences, who are turning the spotlight onto these questions and forcing the scholarship to deal with it. One of the reasons we haven't known a ton about this stuff is because scholarship has been dominated by white men. And that within the last century, that has started to turn, and that turning is hopefully accelerating right now. So the more we have women in positions of influence within scholarship, I think the more we will find out about the role of women in the early church. In fact, one of the papers that I shared a few weeks ago was just published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, arguing that the name Mary Magdalene was not a reference to Mary's hometown. It was not Mary of Magdala. It was a title that meant the towering one. So at some point, Mary, before she was written down in the New Testament, somebody gave her the title, the towering one, which obviously indicates she played a very significant role. And even when she was put into the Gospels, she has a central role in there as well. So I think there's a lot that we'll be learning in the coming years and generations.
I love that you brought that up, because that was such a cool revelation to me to learn kind of the background behind Magdala. And, you mentioned that based on who wrote the book of scripture, we'll learn more or less about women's roles. So considering this, what can we make of scriptures that seem to limit women, such as when Paul says that women shouldn't speak in church?
Yeah, so there are a couple places where that occurs. Once in First Corinthians, and the other in Timothy. Now, Timothy is part of what are called the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy and Titus. And scholars overwhelmingly believe that these were written well after Paul's death, that they were written end of the first century, beginning of the second century by other Christian writers, because one, the language that they use is distinct from Paul. The topics that they talk about are distinct from Paul, and the even the words that they use don't match the words that Paul uses. So the part in Timothy is probably from a later author, and this may be some of those influences creeping in that are trying to marginalize women's voices so that the men's voices can be centered. And the passage in Corinthians, for whatever reason, my memory is failing me, whether it's 11 or 14, but it's in the middle of a discourse about speaking in tongues and prophesying. And I think it's 14. And you get this little passage in the middle of nowhere. It suddenly says that, women should keep silent in church. And then it goes back to talking about the prophesying. And this is peculiar because in chapter 11, Paul is talking about how if women are going to prophesy in church, they just need to cover their heads, have, a head covering on. Mm-hmm. And so scholars are pretty sure that whoever is responsible for the passage in Timothy has probably inserted this into the passage in First Corinthians. I think there's a good argument to make that passage is that those 2 or 3 verses are from a later hand. And this shows some of that influence that creeps in between the writing of these texts and our earliest manuscripts. These are some of the things that we have to disentangle as we're looking at how the scripture developed, trying to reconstruct what the church looked like in its earliest phases. Because if we just try to take everything as one consistent, unified message, it significantly distorts the picture.
Wow, that is very helpful and leads into, what I've said, that I feel both enlightened and confused by every post that you make.
I definitely present a different approach from what most people are used to. And most of the time we see the scriptures as kind of this massive text. We know there is a historical narrative in there, but we almost treat it like one single author is telling this enormous story. And so whatever this passage means in this part over here, this other passage from this part way over here has the same perspective, means the same thing. And the reality is there were hundreds and hundreds of different people involved across centuries, writing for different reasons, trying to accomplish different things. And it makes it a lot more complex when we say, well, this part of this passage is probably from this time period by this person, and this part's from this other time period. But I think it ultimately helps us draw a clearer, more accurate picture of what was going on in the different time periods. And that's going to help us get a better understanding of who Christ is in the New Testament and what his role is, and what is the role of women in facilitating the preaching of his gospel and the establishment of the churches and their spread. And so I think it's exciting work that's being done, and it is complex, and we frequently find stuff we don't understand or don't like, but I think that's all part of the wrestle.
Yeah. Have there been any strategies or anything that you've used when you discover something through your studies that doesn't seem to fit with the narrative that you held as a member of the church? How do you deal with that dissonance?
For the most part, what I do is try to avoid reconciling, because if I try to force a round peg into a square hole, I'm basically having to reshape the peg. And from an academic point of view, which is how I'm trying to approach things, that's going to distort the data rather than clarify the data. And so what I do is try to let that tension stand and wait till I have better data. And there are, I do end up compartmentalizing things. When I am teaching in Sunday school, I'm not quite as critical about things. I don't tell people, no, that word's mistranslated. It's got to be this other way. But from an academic point of view, when I think about these data academically, I let the tension stand. And I say there is likely tension because I don't have enough information. And that's not to say that everything's going to fit together perfectly how I thought before. I'm going to have to adapt my perspective. But if there's something that doesn't fit, it means there's something for me to learn out there. There are data out there that I need to find so that I can understand whether it does fit or whether it fits somewhere else entirely. And that is not something that every last committed believer is willing or able to do. But that's how I approach things from my academic perspective, which is the perspective that I'm trying to center in my social media stuff.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that, because I know a lot of people in our community are trying to do similar things where they're researching and seeking, and sometimes you find a piece that's like, how in the world does this fit? And, it can be easier to just say, well, I guess, to throw the whole thing out. Well, we'll just guess it's all wrong. Or
one interesting thing about the scriptures is there's this principle from the field of social memory, which holds that every community that has authoritative texts, every generation has to renegotiate its understanding of those texts. And they're renegotiating between the sacred past, what their parents believed, what their grandparents believed, what they believed anciently. And they're taking that and they need to look at these beliefs through whatever lenses their own experiences and their own circumstances and their own needs give them. And they need to figure out, how can I make this meaningful to me? How is this going to inform my experiences? And that is going to require new perspectives and new understandings. And even within the official historical narrative of the church, there are things that get left behind. There are things that get decentered. There are other things that get centered. No one is immune from having to renegotiate between the past and the present. And so it is messy, but nobody is free from it. And if we think that we already have the exact same conceptual framework and understanding of the universe that we're going to have 50 years from now, and all that means is we are being too dogmatic to grow and to be stretched, because you cannot possibly grow as a Christian, as a person, without changing the way you look at the world, in my opinion, anyway. I don't speak from any position of authority whatsoever.
No, that's beautiful. That resonates a lot. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Yeah, Jess and I have we've been talking about that lately, of this tendency, this desire to just kind of close the lid and be like, okay, we got it. We figured it out. And, but, President Camille Johnson asked us to ask questions we don't know the answer to. And as you're talking about this, like, I'm picturing you like you're excavating and you're just like pulling out things like, oh, okay, I'll just put that there. I'll just put this here. I'll just like let it all like sit there. And I don't have to, I'm studying it, but I don't have to make a conclusion and close the lid on I've got the answer. And that is a mental exercise. It
is challenging. And I think I frustrate people. I get messages. I've never received so many private messages from people in my life, but I'm getting a lot of messages. And the best I can do is say, I've kind of suspended judgment. I'm just letting it be what it is. And if I find data that help me make sense of something down the road, great. If not, it's just gonna sit there. And I think it's a little arrogant to think that we already have all the answers. And if we can't find an answer to something, then that thing can't be. That is not how the world works.
Thank you so much for that wisdom you've shared. My last question is just sort of recentering for our audience on Heavenly Mother. And I just want to know what your thoughts are, and how do you think that we can better include Heavenly Mother as a church moving forward? What would be the effects of that, whether that's important or not?
I think that there is a lot of room for exploration and for questions. And I would love, and I think we all need to be doing that exploration and asking those questions. And there are, I personally have a number of limits on what I can do and say, but not everybody has those boundaries. And so, as long as there are people out there raising those questions and producing artwork and producing poetry and producing literature and producing scholarship and keeping it in the center of our Latter-day Saint discourse, it will inspire more and more people to pick up that journey as well. And I think that can only help. Nobody anywhere is exempt from growth in the church. And so I hope to see more people coming around to realizing there's a lot to learn about Heavenly Mother, that this was a topic that was approached a lot more openly a long time ago. I think we've kind of clamped down on it to some degree, and I don't think there's anything wrong with prying that open again and taking another look, because I think that is another layer of what can go into our renegotiation with the past, and another thing that can help us stretch us and help us grow and help us find more meaning, more fulfillment, and more hope for the future in that journey. So yeah, hopefully there are people out there who are hoping to strike out in new paths and learn things about Heavenly Mother that nobody else knows right now. And if anything that I can do can help inspire anybody out there, then that's as far as I'm concerned, that's mission accomplished. And I feel like my job is really to kind of highlight a bunch of weird, old, ancient history. Hopefully just to say these are not new questions. These are not new things. These things have been around for a long, long time, as has opposition to these things. And the drawings are weird. Some of the inscriptions are weird, but I find them fascinating. And if that helps somebody make some sense of it, or at least a stepping stone into other research, then I've done my job there.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate that. And it reminds me of something that I don't remember if President Nelson actually said this in October General Conference of 2021, or if it was just something that came to my heart. But I feel like I remember him saying that as we move forward and seek personal revelation, that we, as members, would receive insights that we've never had before. And I kind of apply that to the church. We can receive things that haven't been known, which is, of course, right in line with an ongoing restoration. So it's exciting to me that, like you say, anybody can go and learn and become an excavator, like Kate said, and play a part in this. So thank you for that encouragement.
I think the Latter-day Saint discourse is more a bottom-up discourse than it is a top-down. And that is not to discount that authority at all. It's just to say that we are not all, just plugged into programs and doing what we're told. We can go out and find stuff for ourselves as well.
Well, this has been so great. We so appreciate this. I am already thinking of all the people that I'm excited to share this with. So for our listeners, if they want to learn more from you, how can they find you? Papers that you've done, and obviously social media. Will you share that with us?
Yeah. So on my most of my social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, I have the same username. It is the phonetic spelling of my last name that I used on my mission. So McClellan, McClellan. So Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. I do different things across those different platforms. Don't look for me on Twitter unless you want to see residual political stuff from me. I keep all of that off of TikTok, and it's a little of everything on Instagram. Not so much these days. It's mostly the scholarship these days. But I also have I've got a book coming out, hopefully later this year. This is a fully revised version of my dissertation where I talk about the conceptualization of deity and divine agency through the lens of the cognitive science of religion. So I talk about when ancient Israelites and Judahites thought about God, what precisely were they thinking about? I'm excited about that book. And a lot of my scholarship, if it's not on my blog, I'm on academia.edu, and I don't know if your listeners are familiar with some of these hoity-toity scholarship aggregation sites, but I post most of my stuff as soon as my contract allows me to post it there. So you can find most of my scholarship, but you just have to look for my full name, which is Daniel O. McClellan. And I've published a number of papers recently on Psalm 82, on 2 Nephi 25-23. I've published on that recently. I've got some discussions of early Christology. I published on King James Version of the Bible and for a Latter-day Saint press. So yeah, I'm not too difficult to find online, which unfortunately is another relic of having run for office.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much. All these opinions are my own and don't represent the perspectives of my employer.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it. And if you haven't yet, please leave us a review. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can make a monthly donation at anchor.fm/inherimage. You can also send us a voice message at the same website, sharing one of your stories about Heavenly Mother. We would love to hear it and might even share it in a future episode. We hope you'll tune in next Sunday for another inspiring episode.